Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our program, Partners in Law. This is a program which is hosted by the Cebu Lady Lawyers Association in collaboration with the Philippine Earth Justice Center, or PEJC. So this evening, we will be talking about a very important issue, which is about our own marine heritage at the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea for the others who would want to recognize it as such. This evening, we have a very special guest that will join us, who will join us in our discussion this evening regarding the environmental damage in South China Sea. So this is your host, Attorney Liza Osorio, with the Philippine Earth Justice Center. And together with me, I have my co-host, our fellow Attorney Joy Argallon. Good evening, Joy.
Good evening, Attorney Liza. Thank you. Good evening to our audience, and we're here for an hour of discussion regarding environmental issues.
Yeah.
And tonight, we're very glad and honored to have here with us a very prominent biologist who has helped the Philippines in its case regarding the rights of the Philippines on the disputed islands in the South China Sea. So, allow me to introduce. His work actually has led to the discovery of the Center of Biodiversity, which is located in the Philippines. And he is, as mentioned earlier, he is the consultant of the legal team of the Philippines. So, our guest for this evening, Dr. Ken Carpenter. Good
Yeah.
evening.
Welcome.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome, Dr. Kent.
Thank you very
Carpenter.
much. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, so thank you for accepting our invitation to join us tonight, because I think it's very timely that we will be discussing this, as I think many Filipinos would want to hear about what's happening in our marine heritage, which is in the western side of the Philippines. So let me start our discussion by asking, well, as mentioned by Joy, you were part of the legal team, but although you're not a lawyer, but you're part of the legal team in our case with the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. So can you please discuss with us your role as part of the legal team?
So in 2014, I was asked by the legal team that represents the Republic of the Philippines to help them compile some environmental case against the People's Republic of China and what they're doing in the West Philippine Sea. And I'm a scientist. I'm not a lawyer. And of course, people might ask, why would a scientist be involved in this high stakes legal case that was heard in the Permanent Court of Arbitration in the Hague, in the Peace Palace in the Hague.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is that, as everybody knows, most of the case, the Republic of the Philippines versus the People's Republic of China, had to do with a territorial dispute. Everybody knows that there are different countries that claim parts of the South China Sea, and in particular, the Spratly Islands, which are a number of beautiful submerged reefs in the central part of the West Philippine Sea. And so I was asked to provide some of the science that could be used to prosecute according to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, is a very long document,
Yes.
many parts, and it took a couple of decades actually to negotiate this treaty. The treaty is signed by many countries around the world, including China and the Philippines, and all of the countries that are vying for territory in the South China Sea. So the part of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that I was dealing with are the ones dealing with the marine environment.
So the UNCLOS is actually known as the constitution of our oceans, right?
Yes.
And so it governs many of the activities for the protection of our oceans. And as you said earlier, there was a particular provision, or two provisions in particular, that was really the central basis for the pursuit of the case by the Philippines against China.
Right.
Yes.
So Part 12 is the part of UNCLOS that deals with the marine environment, or protecting the marine environment. So Article 192 is sort of a general statement that says that all countries who are signatories to the treaty are obligated to protect the marine environment.
Yeah.
Of course, there's two parts of the ocean that you can protect. You can protect your own territorial waters, and you also need to worry about whether or not anything that you do in your own territorial waters might somehow spill over into international waters or into the territory of some other country. So the first part of 192, Article 192 that we dealt with, had to deal with whether or not any country, the People's Republic of China, were following their own policies in the South China Sea. So the UNCLOS basically says that if you're going to protect the environment, you have to use your own laws in your own territory. And as we know, the PRC started building islands. So they created new islands out of submerged reefs. And in order to do that, according to their own policies, they would first need to complete what's referred to as an environmental impact statement.
Yeah.
An EIS is basically saying what will happen to the marine environment if you change it in such a way. So according to their own policy, they should have completed an EIS. And despite this being their policy, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in our work found no evidence that an EIS was done prior to the building of islands on at least 6 different submerged reefs of the West Philippine Sea.
Yeah. It should also be pointed out that during the case itself, I understand that PRC did not send any delegate, did not send any of their lawyers or representatives, right? They did not, in other words, participate in the proceedings.
Yes, the PRC stated that since the arbitration between the different countries was under the auspices of ASEAN, that it should continue under the auspices of ASEAN. So they did not recognize the Permanent Court of Arbitration case, even though they are signatories not only to UNCLOS, but also signatories to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which of course is sometimes referred to as the World Court, and it's in the Peace Palace in The Hague. So yeah, the hearings that were held in The Hague actually had a very large Philippine delegation composed of government officials, the legal team, and 2 experts. And during the entire time, there was a table left for the PRC in case they ever decided to attend.
Yeah.
So there's fresh water every day and writing materials all set up in case they sent a delegation. So they were very accommodating in hopes that the PRC would attend, but unfortunately they did not attend.
Yeah. But I think if you read the decision of the PCA, the PCA said that it didn't matter that they did not participate because they were in fact informed about the proceedings, and it was, it was not a defective proceeding even if they were not present during the proceeding. So that's why the case continued, in other words.
And to add to that, Attorney Liza, if I remember correctly, there even if they were not participating in the proceedings, it was because rights of one country were affected, and it was China who was caused such violations of these rights under the UNCLOS. So I guess that until this, that was in 2015,
yeah.
and then until now, China has still not complied with any of the decision of the PCA ruling.
Yeah. So you earlier mentioned that there were two scientists during the proceedings, and of course one of that was you, but you also mentioned another scientist and what their role. Can you tell us what the role of the others and your role?
Well, my role was specifically to speak to environmental issues. So the damage that was done to coral reefs in the West Philippine Sea. The other expert, his name was Professor Clive Schofield, and he is a professor at Wollongong University in New Zealand. And his expertise deals with the definition of an island. And as I've said, a definition of an island sounds sort of trivial because we all know what an island is, right? And of course, being in the Philippines where you have over 7,100 islands.
600 islands.
Oh, yeah, okay. So we know that, we know what an island is. But it's actually a very specialized definition. Because if you have a submerged reef, as are all of the reefs in the West Philippine Sea, there's no actual island there. So you cannot use a submerged reef as a basis for a territorial claim. Furthermore, if you build an island, that, according to international law, does not qualify for being an actual island. So even though they built islands, this does not help their claim for territory in the West Philippine Sea, according to the definitions and according to international law.
Yes, because international is very technical with definition, and especially that it involves the territorial claims of many countries. And I think what's important is, well, there was a definition of an island, which is something that has to sustain life, right?
Exactly.
I think the main question there was whether or not Iraq is considered as an island. I mean, from reading the case, it was quite interesting for me. Like, what will be the strict definition of an island would be? Should it be inhabited, and all these things? And I think at the end of the decision, you can see that the PCA arrived at the conclusion that there were certain parts of Spratlys that would qualify as an island that would generate their own EEZ and their own contiguous zones, but there were others that were not considered as strictly islands.
Yeah, the ones in the Spratly Islands area did not really qualify. So yeah, I am not an expert on what an island is, and I'm not a lawyer, but I did listen to the lawyers and to the cases, and it was clear, in order to qualify as an island, you actually have to have the resources to sustain a human settlement. So you need to have water. You need to have enough soil so that you can actually grow your own food, and enough space for farming or whatever. So an island isn't really an island until it can sustain some sort of human settlement, according to the very strict definitions that they use there. So it was quite interesting for a biologist, somebody who studies fish. I study fish, and that's very different from being a lawyer and looking at those geographic
also for
definitions.
us quite interesting for us to study fish, while as lawyers, we study the law. So turning to the second article, or the second portion of that article about under the UNCLOS, about whether or not the activities conducted by China has resulted to transboundary harm, right? And so I think your role as scientists was very important in this particular question.
Yes, so the first question, as I say, did they follow their own policies, was basically upheld that no, they did not. The second part of Article 192 has to deal with whether or not any damage that they did may have influenced the inland seas or any part of the Palawan or any part of the west coast of the Philippines. And the first thing we had to do, of course, was to show that damage had been done. And we were able to show, using satellite imagery of these submerged reefs, that by building islands, they destroyed very vibrant coral reef ecosystems. And when you destroy a very vibrant coral reef ecosystem, you kill the fish, and when you kill the fish, of course, you kill the possibility for those fish to reproduce. And the reproduction of marine organisms is very special. Almost all marine organisms have what's referred to as a bipartite life history strategy. And that simply means that as adults, we all know fish swim around. Clams and corals are attached to the bottom. But when they reproduce, they spawn their eggs into the water column. And when they do this, the currents, after the eggs have been fertilized, the currents take these eggs away and they eventually develop into larvae. And the larvae can spend anywhere from a few hours and most commonly to weeks and months in the water column. And there they are at the mercy of the ocean currents. So they can actually drift very, very long distances before they actually settle as adults. And so by destroying the coral reefs in the middle of the West Philippine Sea, you destroy their ability to maintain fish populations. When you destroy the fish populations in one area, they're no longer going to contribute larvae that will be transported by the oceans. And the question that we had to look at was, are these larvae in the West Philippine Sea potentially contributing to populations of fishes in the inner part of the Philippines? Mostly the inland seas and the western part of the Philippines. And we have very good modeling evidence. These are mathematical models that they use to understand how quickly the currents can move and how long a larvae may survive in the marine environment, floating around. And these models very clearly show that in the West Philippine Sea there's a high probability of what we refer to as connectivity. In other words, the islands of the West Philippine Sea are contributing larvae and therefore contributing fish and therefore contributing to fisheries inside the Philippines itself. Okay.
So it's quite interesting, but I'm unfortunately we have to take a break.
Okay.
Because we need to have a short, sponsorship message coming from our sponsors.
Okay.
So we'll have to take a break, and for our guests, we will be right back.
Good evening once again to our televiewers, and again this is Partners in Law with the Cebu Lady Lawyers Association and the Philippine Earth Justice Center. So before our break, we were talking about the beginnings of how Dr. Carpenter came into the picture, into the legal team of the Philippines in the Philippine Court of Arbitration case against on the West Philippine Sea. And before we ended, we were discussing a little bit about the contribution of the West Philippine Sea to the marine resources in the inland waters of the Philippines in general.
Yeah, it was quite interesting because Dr. Carpenter was able to break down, in simple terms, why West Philippine Sea is very important to us, and why this case is quite important also for the Philippines to bring against China. So sorry that we had to cut you off earlier, but
No problem.
I guess we can continue with our discussion on the kind of environmental damage that was demonstrated during the case, and to show that why this case was quite important, and your role there was quite important as well.
Okay. So the first thing to understand is that there are hundreds of these reefs in the West Philippine Sea. Each one of these reefs is fairly large, like one of them is like 8.5 kilometers across for the lagoonal area. And these reefs are support a very vibrant coral community, really, really beautiful coral reefs. And I like to use the example of Tubataha. Maybe many of your listeners have heard about Tubataha, which is an absolutely gorgeous series of reefs in the middle of the Sulu Sea. And these are a World Heritage Site. They have been declared as a World Heritage Site because of the vibrant coral reefs that it maintains. And divers dream about the possibility of going to Tubataha Reef because there's beautiful sharks and whale sharks and beautiful fish and corals, and it's just an amazing place to visit. But the West Philippine Sea has not only one Tubataha, it has dozens of these Tubatahas. And each one of these is a very vibrant, beautiful coral reef. And coral reefs, as we had to demonstrate to the tribunal judges, are fragile ecosystems. And what this means is that if you disturb them, particularly due to such things as sedimentation, so they require clear water. In order for coral reefs to survive, they need clear water because not only are they animals, but they also have these little algae that photosynthesize, like plants, inside the body of the corals. And so they require clear water. And because of that, it's a fragile ecosystem. If you disturb their ability to photosynthesize by covering them over with sediment, they will die.
Yeah.
So the court tribunal judges decided that yes, in fact, we had provided enough evidence to convince them that coral reefs are fragile ecosystems. And then, according to Article 194 of UNCLOS, because of that, there's an obligation to protect these fragile ecosystems, particularly because they also support rare and threatened species. Okay, that's another part of the case. But to get back to the coral damage, by building islands on these submerged reefs, you essentially totally destroyed these absolutely gorgeous coral reef ecosystems.
Yeah.
Large areas of these coral
Because
reef ecosystems.
what they did was to cover them.
They cover the coral reefs using what's referred to as a dredger that uses a sort of drill that drills into the sediments in the lagoon and then spews those sediments into the shallow areas of the submerged reefs, and this creates an island.
Yes.
When you do this dredging, you cause a very severe degree of stress to the corals because you're filling the water with lots and lots of sediments. The sediments settle on the corals and smother the corals, but even if they don't totally smother the corals, the sedimentation cuts down on the amount of light that goes into them. And if that is cut off for weeks or months, then the corals die.
It's like being buried alive.
Exactly.
Yeah, right? For the televiewers, it's like, the corals are animals, and then they get buried alive by sand. They get suffocated and then they die because they're literally buried alive. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And one of the things that they were also arguing in the case was that it was already damaged anyway. So, the thing that they did, the dredging and the, putting in the sand to cover the corals was actually, just, a measure that was not really damaging per se to the coral ecosystems because that was already a damaged coral reef. So I think there were some also things that you discovered also along the way.
Yeah, there was, the reason why these reef flats were damaged was because Chinese fishermen were extracting giant clams from the shallow reef areas. So they used hundreds of these small boats to essentially destroy the entire coral reef ecosystem on the reef flat, on the top part of the reef, in order to uncover giant clams. Now, giant clams are themselves very, very valuable as in making ornamental jewelry and a lot of other things. They're referred to as white gold, okay? So in China, there's a long history of using ivory, for example, to make carvings out of. But it's more and more difficult, of course, to get ivory. And instead, they're using giant clam shells, which can be carved and polished, much like ivory can be carved and polished. And these become very, very valuable jewelry and other forms of ornaments. So the People's Republic of China has actually helped to protect the fishermen going out on these reefs and destroying hundreds of these reefs, dozens of these reefs.
Just to get to the giant
Just to get to the giant clams. But even then, they only destroyed the very shallow parts of the reef. And the most vibrant part of the coral reef is deeper, where they did not have these giant clam extractions. So although they covered over damaged reef, it was damaged, number one, because of Chinese illegal fishing. And number two, when they did cover over the damaged part, they also destroyed the reefs inside the lagoons and the very beautiful parts of the reef in the deeper areas as well. So we had very clear satellite imagery that showed that the sedimentation was severe and that it lasted for a long time, and that there's absolutely no doubt that it destroyed the reefs adjacent to the areas where the islands were built.
But what's really clear here, based on the discussion of Dr. Carpenter, is that these are human-induced activities that has caused the damage to the marine ecosystem in the West Philippine Sea. And I think because of the graveness of the damage, are these irreversible damage already?
Well, theoretically, no. But the bad news is that it would take probably decades, if not centuries, to recuperate the coral reefs that have been damaged. So the building of the islands themselves, if you were to somehow to be able to just wipe away those islands, which you could do, it would still take decades for the coral reefs to recover. And because of that, the marine resources that are maintained by those coral reefs are essentially not available for people to use. So probably I would guess almost or over 100 years, if not a couple of centuries, before those reefs could recover, if they were totally wiped free of the sediments that were on top of the islands.
You were also saying that, because this was a vibrant coral reef area before the artificial islands were built, there were also a number of important species that were found there. And I think that was one part of your work that was quite, relevant in this case.
Yeah, according to every signatory country of UNCLOS, they're required to help to protect the environments of threatened species. So one of the questions is were there threatened species in the South China Sea that were being exploited or damaged by the activities of building islands? And we use the International Union for Conservation of Nature's criteria to determine whether a species is threatened, whether it's at risk of extinction. And we were able to show that corals that are threatened, giant clams that are threatened, sharks and rays that are threatened, and also groupers, lapu-lapu, that are threatened, were all there, and were all being, number one, exploited by Chinese fishermen, so they weren't meeting their obligation to protect these threatened species. And number two, they were also, by destroying the coral reefs, also not protecting the environments of the threatened species. So there's also things like sea turtles that require, that are dependent upon those environments as well.
So, so obviously there were threatened species that were affected because of their activities there. And I think we will have to, again, pause for a minute for some reminders from our sponsors. And when we come back, we will discuss, what we can do moving forward. After the case, what were actually the results of the case and what we can do in moving forward with this issue in the West Philippine Sea. So we will be right back.
Welcome back to our show, Partners in Law, with the Cebu Lady Lawyers Association and the Philippine Earth Justice Center. So earlier, before the break, we were discussing about the gravity of the environmental damage in the West Philippine Sea and the PCA arbitration case. So now we will discuss what to do next. What are the ways forward? What can we do to save or protect further the West Philippine Sea?
And I think just to follow up as well, I would like to also ask Dr. Carpenter, what was the final decision with regard to the environmental damage of South China Sea in that PCA case, so that we can also discuss what needs to be done.
So according to the ruling of the very distinct judges in the tribunal, we had 5 different components to our environmental case. And of course there was the territorial case as well. And the judges ruled that in fact the part of the West Philippine Sea that the Philippine claims is, according to UNCLOS, a part of the Philippines. So that was one thing. The territorial dispute went in favor of the Philippines.
Yeah.
For the environmental components, again, we had 5 different components. They ruled for the Philippine case, and every single one except for one. So the policy, they didn't follow their policies. The Chinese government did not protect threatened species. In fact, they exploited them. Coral reefs are fragile ecosystems, and they should have been protected, but coral reefs were not protected. In fact, they were damaged quite severely by both the giant clam extraction and by the building of the reefs themselves. And then the 5th component was the connectivity component. And although we had good modeling data for that, the Permanent Court of Arbitration didn't rule totally in favor of the Philippines, because they thought that it would be good to have real genetic data to demonstrate that there's connectivity between the West Philippine Sea and the inland seas of the Philippines. So almost all the components of the case were ruled in favor of the Philippines, of the Republic of the Philippines.
Yeah. So there, I understand that there were also some limitations as to the fact that you were only able to present the modeling to demonstrate the connectivity of the species, and I think this now goes into like what can be done next, so that we can address the limitations.
Well, the obvious thing to do next, I think, is to try to actually complete the genetic studies that would be required to demonstrate if in fact the West Philippine Sea is strongly connected to the inland seas of the Philippines. And so this would be my first recommendation, to allow scientists to go out to the islands of the West Philippine Sea to collect specimens and preserve their tissues so that the DNA analysis can be done. And then do the same thing, the same species, collect them from inside the inland seas of the Philippines. And you can actually do a genetic study to show whether or not the two areas are connected, okay? So that would be number one, to complete the genetic studies. And then I think after that, following up on that, there's several other things that I would recommend. I think the most important thing is to continue diplomatic channels to try to stop the tridacna extraction that's occurring now. Again, as of 2018, we have more satellite imagery that shows that the clam extractions are continuing in places like Scarborough Shoals,
Yes.
which, as we all know, is a valuable fishing area for Philippine fishermen and very close to the Philippines, and according to UNCLOS, belongs to the Philippines. So continuing diplomatic channels, I think, is very important. And I think all Filipinos should try to make it known to the people that you elect how you feel about what's happening in the South China Sea. Do you support the idea that the South China Sea should be part of the Philippines? Do you support the idea that the environment needs to be protected? I think that's important. And finally, I would recommend that more activities take place where scientists meet with lawyers and meet with politicians and other people in order to coordinate sort of the best practices in order to protect the environment in the West Philippine Sea. And again, excuse me, I have one additional recommendation, and that is that unfortunately, because you no longer have this valuable resource in the South China Sea, you now are going to have to work even more hard to manage what you do have in the Philippine Sea. So supporting the efforts of the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, supporting the efforts of managers and NGOs and all different government agencies to work harder to protect and manage the resources that you do have, because they're no longer being supported by what is found in the South China Sea.
So there are clearly many recommendations moving forward, but I guess the important one that I can understand is the need to really bring this issue with our policymakers. And I think one of your activities while you're here as part of the U.S. Embassy activities is to meet with the Congressional Committee on the West Philippine Sea.
Yes,
So
yes.
I haven't heard about that one, but I guess that's a new committee, but it's a very important committee. If you can share with us, what they're going to do with this.
Well, I hope to also make the point that the case between the Republic of the Philippines and the PRC is not just a territorial case. The territorial case, admittedly, is the most important, but the environmental case is something that really needs to be recognized and pushed as important just as well, because many scientists and political scientists really think that the main importance of the West Philippine Sea is the natural resources. Okay, so the natural resources of the West Philippine Sea are tremendous in terms of fishery resources, potential tourist resources, shipping lanes.
Yes.
Everything there is really, really valuable. And you no longer really have the use of those resources. So this is a big loss, and consequently, more work really needs to be done there.
One of the things that actually was advanced was to have it declared as a joint marine protected, a big marine protected area, so that you can have at least a joint goal of protecting the area rather than just having one nation exploit and destroy the
Yeah.
area. So I think, do you think that is feasible?
I think that's a very, very valuable recommendation. So the idea that you can, instead of just one country owning those submerged reefs, is to have it as sort of a joint ownership and a joint area where the resources are managed. I think this is a good idea. A freedom park, I think, is
Yes.
is one suggested term for this, and where you essentially manage this as a marine protected area. And yes, I think that's a very valuable suggestion. Whether or not it's actually practical or not, I'm really not sure. I think we have to ask our politicians and
Yeah.
generals whether or not that's actually
Because I think one needs to understand that this is a common heritage of mankind, not only for a particular country, for us Filipinos, but for everyone, because of the value that the South China Sea brings, not only to the Philippines. I think based on your modeling, it not only gets to the Philippines, the larval dispersal, but also it contributes even to other
Neighboring
countries. or
it's true,
neighboring
particularly
countries.
Malaysia and other areas. So.
And other areas as well. So
And
it's-
for a country like the Philippines, wherein we're surrounded by waters, it's really important for people to actually realize the value and the importance of preserving this very diverse ecosystem in the West Philippine Sea. And I think it's also a challenge for scientists, lawyers, and policymakers, or even NGOs, to get this message to the people, so that so that it will make them take action. It will give them an idea that we should protect this specific area, because I think the problem here is there's a really disconnect between the people understanding the importance of something so far away from them, and when eventually we will realize that we will be facing problems with the fish supply because of what you mentioned earlier, the connectivity of the resources from the West Philippine Sea, and how it affects the resources also in the waters within the Philippines. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really important. That's why I think we are here. This is one way of really disseminating information, and I think it's a challenge also for the televiewers. I hope who are listening or watching us right now to also read more about this issue and learn more, so that they can have a more informed discussion, or and also suggestions on what to do next with regard to the protection of our resources. And it's not only to be dominated by scientists, by lawyers, but also ordinary Filipinos should be well informed about this. So I'd like to thank the U.S. Embassy for actually bringing Dr. Carpenter here in Cebu, and joining us for the forum this afternoon. We had a
Yes.
forum at the University of Cebu earlier, and it was quite important to have this venue, or for discussion with the students,
students,
for the young ones who are now, I hope, more informed about this particular issue. As well as Dr. Ken Carpenter for coming here. I know that you have a very close relations with the Philippines. Being here,
Yes.
you were here since 1975.
75 was my first time in the Philippines. Yeah, I was a Peace Corps volunteer.
Yes.
I was a Manila volunteer. So
Kabalo, he knows Tagalog, by the way.
Tagalog ako, pero kasabot ko ng ang Bisaya,
Dili siya
pero
mabaligya.
dili ko magsulti.
Yeah, he was here even before you were born, Joy. So, yeah, I was fortunately around 5 years old then.
Well, I was only 2 at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, so Dr. Carpenter's really been here for a long time,
Yeah.
and it's always a pleasure to welcome him back to us. I know that his heart really belongs to the Filipinos.
Yes, I love the Philippines. Cebu is one of my favorite places in the Philippines. I've done a lot of work on Mactan Island, and
Really?
so I've done a lot of research in this area.
Yeah.
So it's always a pleasure to come back here. I'd like to applaud you all for bringing these issues up to your viewers, and hopefully many of them will be more informed because of your efforts to bring this issue to Cebuano.
Yeah, it's really important that we can share this knowledge about the West Philippine Sea, because I know when upon reading the case we can always assign it to our students to read, and it's a hard case to read.
Yes.
It takes a lot of hours of reading, and my students, even if they're law students, would always protest against me assigning them this case. But what more with others, who doesn't really have a time and effort to really understand the case. So it's really good that you're able to make it, simpler, more understandable for our televiewers regarding this case, and also, it's important for also the young generation to have ideas as to what they can do, and based on your recommendations, I guess it's important, given the climate that we have here in the Philippines, to also focus on this particular issue, because it's about food security.
Yes.
And as a conservation biologist, you very well know that how important fisheries is in the Philippines, right?
Exactly.
Yes, and so with some of the scientists from University of the Philippines, they were able to also show that the impacts really are very negative, with activities going on in the West Philippine Sea. They're saying that the lapu-lapu, I just want to for our, especially our Cebuanos, the lapu-lapu grouper was really impact, the impact on the lapu-lapu or grouper population in that area was really bad, right? Because I think Dr. Onda was saying, like, they were exchanging, some of the fishermen there, the lapu-lapu, but what they were getting was already like smaller.
Yeah.
And what is the implications of that as a
Well,
conservation?
that means that they're fished out all the big ones, and the smaller ones don't have time to grow up to be large because they're fished before they get to be large enough. So this is a simple, obvious case of overexploitation, overfishing.
And what's
yeah.
the importance of lapu-lapu for
Well,
our
Well, syempre, masarap yan, di ba? So, lapu-lapu,
Yes,
is a very
masarap.
popular fish in
Fish.
the Philippines. It's a very delicious fish. But they're at the top of the food chain, so they're predators, and of course, they're very important components of the marine environment. So, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a sign, I guess, it's a sign of a healthy reef if you have lapu-lapu, because
Yeah.
you still have the apex species, as they say,
Yeah.
in your reefs. But if you don't have any more lapu-lapu, that means it's time to be alarmed.
Yeah.
Right.
Lalo na pag malaki yung lapu-lapu, mas importante yung talagang may malaki na
Yeah.
dako
Na lapu-lapu.
na lapu-lapu.
Okay. Anyway, so we'll have our last 5 minutes for our parting messages to our televiewers. So we'd like to ask you to address our televiewers and send them a message.
Well, I would say that the most important thing is to try to understand environmental issues. It's also very important to understand that fishing and fisheries is a very important component of the Philippines. We all know that Filipinos love fish. And of course, we should continue to fish and use those for our food. But it's also important to understand that unless you manage the fisheries well, unless you fish sustainably so that future generations can also eat these fish, that you're going to be depriving citizens and your children of fish in the future. We know that fishing in the Philippines has caused some fishes to go locally extinct. So there are a number of species that used to be very common in the Philippines that are no longer found in the Philippines because of overexploitation. So we need to manage. We need to ask our fishermen to fish sustainably. We shouldn't ask them to stop fishing because, as you know, this takes food away from Filipinos, from their families. This is their livelihood, and we shouldn't say that they should stop fishing. But we can also ask them to fish sustainably so that their children have a chance to fish in the future. And we know if they don't fish sustainably, that there's a very good possibility they will be damaging the resource to the point where it can no longer recover. So, and the environment is important. It's not just an ethical issue. It's an issue for livelihoods of future generations of Filipinos.
So thank you so much for that very
Yes.
heartwarming message and very important message for our televiewers. So Joy?
I think as a message to jumping off from what Dr. Carpenter has mentioned, and even from the forum this afternoon, it's really important to have knowledge on information on this matter, especially to the people who does not really understand the issue in general. So it's a task, it's a challenge for lawyers, like educators, to bring this issue to the common people, to help them understand, because we need all of our efforts are needed in order to protect this very important marine environment of ours. And we know that a large majority of the Filipinos are very dependent on the resources that we get from our oceans. So it's really high time to make this an important issue in the country, and maybe to also be open to discussions regarding this, because in creating discussions and conversations about this with friends and people in your family, you also change their lifestyle, change the way they think about the environment, and change their actions in general. So we're glad and honored to have this discussion with Dr. Carpenter this very important day.
Thank you so much, Joy. And to our televiewers, as Joy was saying, knowledge is power, and with power, as I say, comes great responsibility. So that's what Superman said. But anyway, I guess it's our responsibility to inform people about what's happening in our country. And the South China Sea is not only all about a territorial dispute. It's also about in the environment. And I guess we need to highlight that fact. And the environment is what everyone needs. The environment is what we all need as Filipinos, for us to be able to live. And as a part of our intergenerational responsibility, we need to protect this not only for our generation but also for future generations. So with that, we will end this program, and I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Carpenter, and my co-host, Joy Argallon. Thank you so much for watching Partners in Law. This has been Attorney Liza Osorio together with Attorney Joy Argallon of the Philippine Earth Justice Center in cooperation with the Cebu Lady Lawyers Association. Maayong gabi sa tanan.